Welcome to Coffee and Conversation today. We're really excited to have all of you here, and we're really excited for anybody who's listening to the recording on YouTube. Today we've got with us Luna Allen-Bakerian, who is our race equity and public policy strategist for YWCA Minneapolis. In this role, Luna builds and maintains community partnerships and coalition relationships and leads the development of our state and local legislative agenda and surrounding advocacy. Originally from Los Angeles, Luna holds a Master of Public Policy degree with a focus on political engagement from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science with a minor in Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. She brings city, state, and federal government experience, as well as experience in gender equity and inclusion programming in higher education. Luna's done a really wonderful job since coming on board here at the YWCA, and has been working really hard to help us pass a number of bills and get more involved with the state legislature. And so we're really excited to have her here today to share some of that work that she's doing and also share some insights with you about things that are coming up. So with that introduction out of the way, I'll turn it over to Luna so that she can share everything with you.
Thank you, Chandler. And oh my goodness, I didn't realize my bio was going to be read. It's interesting, our team. So if you were at last month's Coffee and Conversation, or you have watched it, you can watch it online with Angela Miles, who leads our department. She's the Vice President of Racial Justice and Public Policy. There are several of us on our team, and we were just recently talking about how we might want to update our bios to include what's a book we're reading right now about racial justice that we like, or different resources, because we've been so ingrained to write our bios with here's my education and here's my da-da-da. But good morning. Thank you for joining. If you are wondering about the picture behind me, sometimes we get questions about these on virtual meetings. Chandler also has a photo in the background. We're in our downtown Minneapolis office. And when they redid this office several years ago, the team working on it decided to use photos from the archives of YWCA Minneapolis as conference room photos. So if you're ever in our space, you will see that there are photos all around from our archives showcasing, swim lessons historically. Chandler's in front of a camp in northern Minnesota, women's camp. But just in case you're wondering that, because sometimes we hop on meetings and people are like, who's behind you? So good morning. Thank you for joining, and thank you for your support of our organization. I'm Luna. I serve on the Racial Justice and Public Policy team, and I'm excited to talk to you this morning about public policy as it pertains to YWCA Minneapolis and beyond. There's a lot of really exciting things happening right now. And so I have a little presentation, and I always give the caveat that I am a public policy person and not a designer. And so just bear that in mind. So let's rock and roll. This is a corny little acronym that I made for an internal legislative training, which uses YWCA's letters to say why we care about policy. We could apply this in several ways, but basically, what I'm hoping you get out of this is why we care about policy at YWCA Minneapolis, but also people who are part of our community stand behind our mission and alongside our mission. And so policy is a huge part of all parts of our mission: eliminating racism, empowering women and girls, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. So one of the things that our team talks about all the time is language. And so I start almost everything I do with our mission in its entirety, because it fuels what we do, and it's ever changing. What peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all looks like today is different than even perhaps yesterday, as our systems are changing, as we seek to dismantle systemic oppression. So I'm always leading with our mission, but this is a little bit about why we care about YWCA policy. Grab your coffee if you don't have it, or tea, or water, or invisible beverage, and let's hop in. So I love these. This was an online generate a Powerpuff version of yourself. And so I think these appeared in last month's Coffee and Conversation too, but these were some little characters that we made to showcase our team for a team-wide presentation that we did at the Facilitating Racial Equity Conference last fall. And so here's me in the middle, but I'm a part of the Racial Justice and Public Policy team, which is a dynamic and multiracial team of 6. I lead public policy, and so I'm in charge of our policy strategy, our advocacy, getting folks on board, being in coalition and community, as Chandler mentioned, but also many of us are cross-trained. So I also am involved in some of the strategic planning work that we do in consultation with other organizations, namely government organizations or folks who are wanting to renew policy strategy, neighborhood alliances. It's really exciting work. And so colloquially, we're known as RJPP, Racial Justice and Public Policy. And I wanted to talk a little bit about why these are in a department together. And so racial justice is a key part of our mission, as is gender justice. These things intersect. And so really racial justice is part of the work of every department. We have a department to focus on, as you've learned before, or you can check out last month's Coffee and Conversation, how we can seek to eliminate racism at multiple levels in the work that we do. And public policy is combined with this because racial justice is a part of all policy issue areas. And so again, we have a very bold mission at YWCA Minneapolis, YWCA broadly, and this allows us to be part of a wide breadth of policy issue areas, because if we're looking at racial and gender justice, anything that's happening in terms of systems change or policy changes intersect with those things. And so I'm a part of the Racial Justice and Public Policy Department, but I am lucky because I get to work with members of many different teams, and I'm consistently learning about the breadth of work that we do. It is remarkable to me. I have great respect for my colleagues who work with young ones in a number of capacities. And because our policy and advocacy work also relates to every piece of work that we do, from health and wellness to workforce development to early childhood education and girls and youth programming. That's a really exciting piece of my work. So this is the sort of three-pronged approach that we talk about for eliminating racism at interpersonal, institutional, and systemic levels. And so I wanted to touch on this because typically we think about the work of public policy as being on this systemic level, and it is. So how can we use our power as an organization, mobilize our community for policies that will advance equity and justice? How also can we, as a trusted community hub, get information to the community about what's happening behind, often behind the scenes, right? Like things happen behind closed doors, even if they are constructed not to. How can we get information out that's accessible, that's inclusive about engaging with our systems, our democratic systems, like the legislative process, voting, the census, and just broader conversations about what it means to be civically engaged all the time? And so when our department uses this three-pronged approach, typically some of my work comes to this systemic piece, but I will come back to that in a little bit. So I wanted to talk about public policy, and I like to demystify this a little bit. Those of us who have studied public policy in a graduate manner, even, right? Still, it's a living, breathing thing. So still it's like, what is that? So this is, the screenshot of the definition. And a couple things that stand out is that this is principles. This is about social society. Things are unwritten, but sometimes they are, because it's also about law and statute. And I thought it was interesting that this also came up, that we sort of operate thinking that if we do ill to the public good, it negates everything else that we do. And so the way that I really like to define public policy of any kind, how we do what we do, that's policy. And so public policy is how we do what we do for, by, and with the people. So people as a whole, ordinary and general people, the community, right? All of us in community together. Obviously, there are nuances there, and we have to use history and systems to inform how we do that work. But that's really the basis that I think can be helpful for all of us to think about what this work is. Like, okay, we're advancing policy change. What is that? We want to shift how we do what we do for, by, and with the people if it's not working in service to the people. So I want to come back to this graphic again because I often think about a conversation that I had with a former colleague, Leah Oglesby. I will name her because she's the one who said this at YWCA Minneapolis. This was, if any of you were we had a book conversation in the late summer, fall of 2019, shortly before we welcomed Dr. Ibram Kendi as our It's Time to Talk keynote speaker. So we had a book conversation about how to be an anti-racist. And Lee said, I often think about what it means to change a personal policy. And I thought that was very poignant. We may operate with personal policies, how we do what we do. And she said, I think we can think about policy on a personal level. What is my MO if I encounter someone who is unhoused? How do I think about what I do with my resources? I think about that a lot since she said it 3.5 years ago, about thinking about policy on a personal level as well. Certainly, we have institutional policies, and often it takes advocacy to change those things too. And it can take a long time, too long perhaps. And so we're working to change policy on institutional levels too. Policy review, writing new policy, perhaps creating charters, or just making space and frameworks for conversations about how we do what we do. Is that in disservice to members of our community, especially given what we know about histories of inequity? And then systemic, which is what I started with, which is kind of our initial thought about policy. Broadly, what are the systems that operate education, business, economics, government, and how can we change how we do what we do in those systems to be in service of the people? And so in terms of YWCA Minneapolis's mission, if we're thinking about eliminating racism, empowering women and girls, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all, what we're looking for in policy is policy that will seek to do those things, or policy that edits, gets rid of, dismantles the ways that we're doing things that are not in service to particularly communities of color, gender minorities in Minnesota and beyond. This is a picture of our public policy agenda. So one of the exciting things that we've done in the last 1.5 years or so is create an internal policy advisory council. And so that's members of several departments and business units who come together on a monthly basis, sometimes more frequently, depending on what's needed, for two-way information. As I mentioned, some of the exciting work of public policy in this organization is getting to learn more about what's happening in all the different areas of our work. And so a primary reason that we created the council was so that our policy and advocacy work is informed by the people who are experts, who are working with children and youth, who are engaging with donors and supporters, who are running health and wellness centers and bringing people into fitness classes, who are training teachers, right? So the Policy Advisory Council brings information in so that that expertise informs what we're doing. And it's also one of several ways to get public policy information into our organization and thusly into the community. This is an agenda that came together largely based on review from that council. And so again, something that can be a challenge, but is also a real blessing, is having this really bold and dynamic mission. We are a nonprofit organization. We are a nonpartisan organization, and we have a mission that is nonpartisan. This is something that I say a lot. Issue areas that are part of our mission are often made out to be partisan issues, but in truth, the elimination of racism and the empowerment of women and girls, peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all, right, are written into governing documents that were established in this country when people wanted to create a government system. And those are nonpartisan things that we're seeking. And so when we do work in service of that mission, that's nonpartisan work. Certainly as a nonpartisan organization, we never endorse candidates. We do consistent training to be in line with what is expected of nonprofit, nonpartisan organizations. But we really are lucky to have a mission that allows us to be in community with so many other organizations that do incredible work, to be able to advocate for policy change that will bring forward these things. And so, as you can see, this is an agenda that has some areas that we lead: racial and gender equity in our systems, institutions, and organizations. That gets back to that chart that we just looked at. Early childhood education and out-of-school time youth programming that is affordable, accessible to families, inclusive, and representative of Minnesotans, bolstered by well-paid and supported educators. So that's two-pronged. It's wonderful care and also wonderful support of educators and providers. And then robust financial and infrastructure, and I'm thinking moral support for the nonprofit sector and folks who do work to be in community with our neighborhoods, our people. On the support and endorse side, so again, we are a member of a number, excuse me, we're a member of a number of coalition groups with other organizations, some that do work similar to ours, some that maybe do a lot of very different work, but coalitions like Early Childhood Education Advocates, Racial Equity and State Budget Bites, the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, Public Policy Cabinet, Ignite After School Policy Coordinating Council. We sit on the organizing table for Youth Day at the Capitol, right? There's all of these ways that we're in community with others. And so there are things that we're able to endorse, even if we're not leading in that area. That's a lot of things, because there's a lot of other people who are leading in areas that we support. So we certainly have a leading program in workforce development, and broader economic security infrastructure is something that we support through efforts that the Minnesota Budget Project is leading, equitable taxation, things that will impact our communities, working communities that we interface with at our centers every day. Health equity, particularly as that pertains to race and gender, and civil and human rights for Minnesota residents across identities. And then this broad stripe at the bottom of the slide is civic engagement and education with an equity framework that is inclusive and accessible for all. So that is something that we lead in. We provide trainings. We try to provide as many resources and make them as accessible as possible. We had grant funding to do some work around that during the 2020 census year. We're certainly very engaged anytime there is an election upcoming, just to disseminate information that is inclusive. And that's also something that we support when other organizations are really taking the lead on that. Nonprofit vote, when we all vote, Common Cause Minnesota and USA, things like that. One note that I'll say here is that as an organization that serves a multiracial, multigender, multi-identity, intersectional constituency, something that's important about civic engagement education is that it gets the information out there to make it accessible so that folks can engage with our systems. And it really validates very real mistrust that several communities have with systems like our government that have effectively shut people out or been threats or kind of reasons for fear, right? Still today. And so that's a balance that we strike when we're doing education with community, because we don't negate those very real experiences, even as we seek to give information to people if they would like to engage with our democratic processes, for example. Okay, some exciting things. I was going to do a little collage, but I just thought I would talk about them. So the nature of our public policy work historically has focused a lot on early learning and supporting providers and parents and out of school time programming. And that's still a big part of what we do. And we've been able to, as you see, grow our agenda very broadly. Some really exciting things just happening right now. So it's spring of 2023. We're right in the middle of the legislative session. It is a busy one over there. And so we have 4 bills at the state capitol this session that are seeking to infuse some funding into our programs and structures. That is really exciting. We're working with a lobbying team at Frederickson and Byron, including former legislator Jeff Hayden on that. We have a Capital Pathways intern this semester. And so Citizens League Minnesota has an internship program for BIPOC undergraduate students to have experience with public policy careers. This is the first year that we are a host organization. We use a tool that I will touch on in a little bit called Plural. It used to be called Civic Eagle, if you're familiar. to track legislation, and that's a tool that comes from a locally sourced Black created and led technology firm. So we have our 4 bills. I will talk about this in a minute to invite you, but we're going to have a YWCA Day on the Hill that will be advocacy with our sister sites across Minnesota. That is, from my understanding, the first time like all the statewide sister sites are going to get together in this fashion at the Capitol. If you know otherwise, let me know. My email's at the at the end of the presentation. We're really excited about that. And one of the big goals for 2023 for this legislative session and beyond, all the time, but that was a goal set intentionally for this year, was to really see how we could get more members of YWCA Minneapolis staff involved in legislative and public policy more broadly initiatives, and members of the community. So a couple of things that have been really cool. We've been able to be out there at several days on the Hill. So YWCA Minneapolis has had a presence at several days on the Hill to show support and advocacy for other organizations or coalitions or issue area advocacy days that we're in alignment with. And so there's a blog that was something that I had to share. There's a recent blog about Reproductive Freedom Lobby Day that shows some folks at the Capitol from many different departments. And other exciting things include, we're going to be doing some postcarding. Oops, let's start it over. Sorry, everyone. You're going to get a little refresher of this whole presentation. We're going to be doing some postcarding. Our YWCA Day on the Hill is part of the national Until Justice Just Is campaign from YWCA USA. So we will, of course, be linking local policy initiatives with broader advocacy for racial and gender justice. So these are just a handful of really cool things. A delegation of staff and youth went to the Minnesota State Capitol for a sort of after hours tour a few weeks ago. That was a blast. There were about maybe 15 to 17 of us, including students from Youth in Action, which is a program led by our Girls and Youth Department that focuses on advocacy, activism, and art. So that was something that was really energizing as well. Upcoming, there will be, let's see, today's the 15th. It's Ides of March. That's very apropos, Chandler. Did you plan it? All politics all the time. So next week, we're going to have a legislative lunch and learn on Thursday. I believe it's the 23rd. And so that'll be at noon. It'll be virtual, excuse me. And that's an opportunity to just do a quick legislative training, learn about what's happening at the Hill, learn some practices. Oh my goodness, learn some practices for advocacy, particularly in advance of our YWCA Day on the Hill. So all of you are invited to join us as advocates on Monday, March 27th at the Capitol. That will be YWCA Day on the Hill, again, with our sister sites in St. Paul, Duluth, and Mankato. We'll all be bringing advocates. We're going to have a rally in the Rotunda at 10 a.m., and we're going to have meetings with legislators and commune with each other and uplift mission-aligned policies and say thank you for legislative wins that have already happened. We will be linking a registration link below, I think, the link of this video in whatever way you might be viewing it. And so it's obviously free to attend. Advocacy is our right and privilege all the time. But if you are interested in joining us, it is a Monday during the day, which I know can be tricky, but we would love to have you. This is another piece of information that I've been using in some internal and external legislative trainings, which is where to learn more about public policy. Some of this is legislature specific, so just keep that in mind since we're right in the middle of that season. But NPR, audibly, but also written online, has a great politics website. You can see here from some of these images, I think public media is a great place to get information. It's their duty to report to us on what's going on in an unbiased fashion. TPT Almanac, similarly, that's our local public broadcasting station. An almanac is weekly, and it usually features interviews with lawmakers, panels of community advocates and activists, and a lot of really helpful information to give context to what's going on at the Capitol. The Minnesota House and Senate Media Services have a YouTube. You can watch legislative hearings all the time. If they're on live, they're live streamed, you can watch. And so if you want to be attuned to what's happening in the Taxes Committee, the Agriculture Committee, or the Early Childhood Education, right? Education, Policy, and Finance Committees, those are things that are accessible to view and might inspire you to go testify in a committee. The Minnesota Legislature webpage broadly has committee schedules, laws, anything that you might want to track about our state lawmaking process. On Twitter, if you are a Twitter user, even if you're not, you can look up #MNLeg. And so this is a kind of catch-all Twitter hashtag, which means that it has some very wild things, and it also has anything tweeted out by caucuses at the legislature, members themselves. And so it's a little bit of a catch-all. I'm not a Twitter user, but I will sometimes just look that up in a search engine and see what's been recently tagged with that, because it does end up being sort of a helpful collage of what constituents are saying, what lawmakers are saying, organizations that are having days on the Hill, laws that are being passed, right? The Minnesota Secretary of State's office is an amazing resource all the time. They can help you figure out what's happening locally, who's on the ballot, what's on your ballot, who's in office, et cetera. And then Plural, as I mentioned, is the name of the legislative tracking tool that we use. If you, as a YWCA community member, ever want to take a look at that, hop on a call with me. I'm happy to walk you through it. If there's any information in this presentation that you just want to chat more about, I have my email listed. I wanted to take a moment to say thank you for your support of our organization. Obviously, those of us who work here for a reason, and that is the mission-driven work that we do. And so we really appreciate you being engaged with us in all of the ways that you are. And I invite you to become more engaged in policy and advocacy if that feels energizing to you, or if you have a curiosity about it and are just like, I'd like to know a little bit more about that. I will, before questions, just say, oops, oh, I thought I had my email in here. Okay, my email will also be listed so that if you want to chat more about any of these things, or have ideas, or want to come to the Capitol, not on YWCA Day on the Hill if you can't make it, but want to come to a day where we have a hearing. Other things that are helpful for us are to thank legislators. And so one of the things that we'll be doing in partnership with Day on the Hill is saying thank you to bill authors who have authored YWCA bills at the Capitol, and those who have authored bills that are in line with our mission. Things like the Crown Act, things like restoring voting rights to folks with a felony conviction after incarceration is done. A lot of exciting things happening. So that's a lot of words from me. And with that, what questions do you have? Chandler, if you're speaking, your microphone is off.
That happens to me so often.
There you are.
There we go. I just had a few questions for you kind of about the work that you do. And I wanted to start with, the YWCA has a pretty broad mission, and a mission that covers a lot of very different departments, very expansive areas. How do you decide, you kind of being one person working frequently with our lobbyist on the Hill, how do you decide kind of which bills to focus on, which bills to kind of start with? How are those decisions made?
That's a great question. And as I mentioned, that's something that's a challenge and I think a blessing for our organization. So I would say a couple of things. One is if there are apparent needs that are arising within our program areas. And so we have our, YWCAs all share the same mission and then enact the mission in very different ways. And so we have sort of the maybe 5 to 7 ways that we are enacting the mission through program and relationship. And so if there are very real concerns arising in those ways, right? Like accessibility to get to our health and wellness facilities, accessibility of health and wellness programming, increasing teacher salaries, right? I think that childcare affordability is, well, and actually care and education, right? Like early childhood education affordability is something front of mind for a lot of folks, because we need to make sure that our educators are compensated well for the critical work that they're doing, and that that education can be affordable for families. And so that's something that remains top of mind because we run 5 early childhood education centers. I think similarly, we're one of the largest providers of out of school time programming in the Twin Cities Metro, and we also have in school time programming. And so opportunities to really fund and support after school always rise to the top. What I will say though is that there are program areas, and then overarching all of the things that become priorities are, again, racial and gender equity. And so it's critically important that we address systemic disadvantages that have happened through policy in the past, and through strategic decisions, right, that have been made in our history, and have that framework whenever we're doing any of that work. A couple other things I'll mention. One, I mentioned our Policy Advisory Council, and that's something that has been very helpful, again, to hear from educators, youth workers, health and wellness professionals, folks who train teachers, like what's happening? What do you think about this? Does this make sense as a priority? Are there other concerns that are not maybe the flashiest concern that are important for us to be part of the conversation around? And then coalition and community groups are also critically important for 2 reasons. One, because it's many minds who are focused on doing great work, and that can help both in deciphering what needs to be done, in delegating and sharing work, and in allowing us to know areas where it's like, okay, that's an area where we're going to step in a little more front and center, and this is an area where there are several organizations that actually, have the capacity and platform to lead, and we can lend our voice, when people see the persimmon, right? That does a lot. So I don't know if that fully answered your question, but I would say, right, the crux of our mission has to always be embedded, but it usually arises from what's happening in our programs, what's happening in our community, and then, similarly, what I'm hearing from team members.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like it's something then that's very kind of changes as things change in real time. We live in a very dynamic environment, especially over the last few years with the pandemic and the economy and everything that's kind of going on now. I'm curious, I know you mentioned a little bit before about Youth in Action, which is a really wonderful program. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about kind of the importance of doing more civically minded education, especially with youth in the community, because you talked a lot about, kind of the systemic effects on several members of our community, particularly who are BIPOC, who have been disenfranchised or who have had to fight certain fights that others of us have not, to kind of get equal representation within the community. What is sort of that importance, or I guess the real benefit of really trying to educate our youth on kind of the past history of civic engagement and kind of the struggle to get to where we are now, and then how we kind of move forward, especially in such a partisan landscape that so many of these youth are kind of graduating into and going to enter the workforce in.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, and it feels timely because we had our It's Time to Act event yesterday on white violence and white silence, which included, many educators and people who interface with young people, and just everyone sort of thinking about what are the histories we're taught, what does that include, both from a narrative perspective and from sort of a praxis and action perspective. And so I think about, history classes, early social studies classes, and maybe we had like a 2-page spread about civil rights broadly. And so I'm actually going to plug a program that I was really, really lucky to participate in when I was growing up, called Sojourn to the Past. And so a Bay Area high school teacher realized that there was not really Black history and civil rights history from this country in his US history textbooks. And so he brought his class on a trip through the South to retrace key moments of the civil rights movement and interface with folks who made it happen. And then it turned into a national program. So high schoolers from around the country would take a 10-day trip, really deep dive on civil rights history, Black history, solidarity, readings, meeting with like civil rights leaders who made it happen. We were incredibly blessed to hear from Congressman John Lewis, right? Minnie Jean Brown Trickey, Elizabeth Eckford. I mean, like it's incredible. So that's something that 100% changed my life, being a part of how I think about history and movement building, and how I decided what I wanted to study further. So that's a personal example, but I think that it's like the few times that I've been able to be part of Youth in Action cohorts. So this has also been a really cool opportunity for our department and the Girls and Youth Department to collaborate on some things, both to bring in presenters and to just lead activities. Everybody, people always say this. I have a colleague who has an Alex Haley quote in their email sign off that says, everything is in our young people, I think. But it's incredible to see, right? Like the ways that young people have both a clear view of what it is we need to do and refreshing new ideas. So they can both see what's happening, how to make things happen, and are like, this is not working. Can we just change that? And then people steeped in systems where like, let's take 20 years maybe to maybe change that, and at the exhaust of so many advocates and so many good people resources. So I don't know that I'm really speaking to your question. I think it's crucial that young people at many levels get information about what it means to be civically engaged. And so we've had this conversation internally just among staff on the Policy Advisory Council. Like, what are your earliest memories of like being community engaged or civically engaged? Did that look like being engaged with your faith organization? Did that look like your family making food for neighbors? Did that look like volunteering that maybe was a requirement for your school? Did that look like a mock election that you did in elementary or middle school? Did it look like student government? Did it look like prom committee? Like all of what are the ways that we can be civically engaged? And then tactics that can be used in so many ways. Again, thinking about that interpersonal, institutional, and systemic chart, like we're civic every day in our organizations, and then also that applies to how we shape our communities. And so I think that's a conversation that we have internally about the young people that we serve, from littles to high schoolers and beyond. But for anyone else with young people in your lives, curious to hear what they're learning, how they're learning about it. I think what I would say about the divide, two things. I meant to mention this earlier when I talked about our mission. One, that nonpartisan does not mean apolitical. If we think about politics or political as being about power, little p politics. And two, that we're able to engage with discourse, but that thinking about civility doesn't prevent us from having tough conversations, because I think that also is something important for young people to learn, is that this also came up at last night's event, right? Like politeness can't be a reason that we're not standing up for human rights, right? For our friends and colleagues of color, for our trans friends and colleagues, so long-winded maybe answer.
No, I love that. And I really like what you had to say there at the end about kind of the increasing partisanship that exists, and the fact that being nonpartisan is not the same as being apolitical, that you're still trying to advance very important issues and be part of the political conversation. You're just not supporting any one party. You're really focused on these issues. And I'm wondering if you could maybe expand a little bit more on some of the challenges that you do face in that space, especially because while being nonpartisan and really focusing on advocating for really what comes down to human rights, and for equity within our community, it has tended to become a partisan issue because it gets framed as there's one political party that is much further on the spectrum of that issue and one political party that is not. How do you, navigate being a nonpartisan kind of institution in this very partisan space where people are frequently kind of creating a more divisive narrative around this issue, if that makes sense? Just, how do you kind of navigate that and still have conversations with legislators that maybe feel that your work is kind of, I guess, conflicting with what maybe their values or their political party's values are?
Just chatting away off mic. I realized that I was still sharing screen, and I thought I would just come be in closer conversation. So I think I'm going to think about this tactically. So like as if all of you who are part of this conversation are also thinking about doing this. Returning to mission, right? I think that sometimes it's just a return to mission over and over, whether that's, again, personal mission statement or value statement, but in our case, the mission of our organization, just returning to mission. It's critical that we eliminate racism. It's critical that we empower women and girls. It's critical that we promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. And that means all constituents of all areas of all parties, right? So that's like not a thing that we can dispute. I think that for folks, I'm always like, how do I talk about partisanship? I think that there are very real issues that Minnesotans are grappling with. I'm thinking about childcare, right? Like that is an issue that spans our state, that spans families across very diverse identities. And so focusing on, I think, people love the Paul Wellstone quote, we all do better when we all do better, but it really requires thinking about like, actually, if we lead with where there's been the most systemic oppression, we all will do better when we fight for folks who have suffered from anti-Blackness, homophobia, right? Like inability to live your authentic self and your identity in the systems that we've created. And so I think about that quote a lot, but like we really have to robust it, if that makes sense. I also think that if there's rhetoric about how conversations about identity are divisive, we can look at the truth, which is that our history is divisive and was divisive. And that is real, right? Like it's important to just acknowledge that as real. There's a really great article called, it's from a few years ago, but I returned to it and appreciate it. I think it's called What We Can Learn from the Germans About Teaching Our History, right? And it's like, if it's true that you have a national history that's not pretty, rather than pretending it doesn't exist, we can really learn it, really know it, really teach our children it, and really make sure we don't do that again. I also feel like that's maybe not an answer to your question. In terms of challenging conversations that can happen on partisan lines, I think the most helpful conversation, again, is to return to the action that's happening. We have deeply impactful program areas, and returning to that work is kind of at center and returning to mission. Does that help? Do you have a hypothetical situation or something?
No,
I don't know if that helps.
That was a helpful explanation. And I think that, you did a good job of pointing out too, that that's such a nuanced space that there isn't sort of a definitive right answer. And I know you and I have talked kind of on our own or as part of the Public Policy Advisory Committee about how that is just a tough space to navigate in an increasingly kind of divisive and insular world where people are kind of surrounded by like-minded people on social media or the internet, and they're not really maybe getting as much of the civic engagement from people that don't believe exactly what they believe, and there's not kind of that, as you framed it, I believe earlier, kind of like the civil, but not afraid to discuss hard topics, kind of conversation. And I just wanted to ask, kind of while we're on this, you mentioned earlier, which I thought was a great quote from the person you previously worked with, about how it's important to kind of change your personal policy and to kind of grow those personal policies in addition to focusing on things like public policy. I'm wondering, if somebody's kind of starting out, like they're just kind of starting to get into the space of being more civically minded, more civically engaged. Do you have any tips or tools or ways that you would recommend people kind of starting that personal policy journey to then kind of be part of the public policy conversation?
Yeah. Two things come to mind right away. One is just to look for a values worksheet. This is something that my colleagues on the racial justice team have been using recently in workshops with community and organizations. Just a worksheet that lists like 100 values, and then you challenge yourself to kind of narrow down, like, what are your top 10? What are your top 5? And I think taking words like that, right? Like value words could be fun, hard work, like justice, democracy, optimism, all of, that's a really helpful exercise, because I've done it now with my team as part of workshops that we've been, doing for other folks. It's hard and it's really cool. It's like, what are my values? What values do I share with others? And then taking those value words and challenging yourself to think about, like, what does that look like in action? So if a value of mine is democracy, what does that look like in action? It's really important to me that everyone has the right to vote. Then that steers you to what advocacy groups you might want to get involved with so that you have some leadership. Like, what is it, if I have values that I'm drawn to, what does that look like in terms of how I personally act or what my personal policies are? If a value is equity, or if a value is sharing, what does that look like in action in my life day to day? And then the other thing that I think is helpful to think about, I've been thinking a lot about how I'm not thinking enough about what's happening right now in terms of dehumanizing trans people in our nation. And I think that something that can be important for us when we're thinking about personal policy is that just because it's not our experience or our truth doesn't mean it's not true. And just because you haven't lived it doesn't mean it's not true. So I think that a lot of people are like, I just don't understand. I'm like, I don't have to understand or have a lived experience, right, to like acknowledge a truth. And that's hard. That's hard work. And that's like sometimes I think how we can get into the nuance of the conversations where there's like seeming disagreements, but we arrive at a place of maybe understanding, or we arrive at like where we know we really need to fight. Maybe I should say that.
Yeah, I really like the way you just talked about to trying to understand that people who are maybe having very different experiences are experiencing a lot of political aggression or policies that are kind of targeted towards them, especially in the trans community, nationally, seeing states like West Virginia, Oklahoma, Tennessee that are passing these very kind of restrictive laws that are targeting the trans community. And I'm wondering, Minnesota's kind of in a unique position because very similar to those states, it has a government trifecta. Just kind of, instead of being on the more conservative side of the government trifecta, is on the more liberal side of the government trifecta here in Minnesota. And I'm wondering if you could just maybe talk for a minute or so about the challenges and opportunities that come with having that government trifecta, because it is such an opportunity for progress. It seems like already a lot of bills are getting passed, but what are some of the challenges and opportunities that kind of come in this moment in Minnesota's legislature?
Yeah. So we had an unexpected trifecta. So DFL control of the House, Senate, and executive in our state. First time in 10 years that's been the case. And the first thing I'll say is that I think this actually is like a cool thing and an opportunity, but there is a lot of drive to act on things that advocates have been working on for a really long time. And in reality, things that have been passed in the past. And so our lobbyist was in the legislature, and they passed a bill to restore voting rights to folks with a felony conviction who had already finished incarceration. And so if you're watching this session, a bill was passed and signed into law. If you have a felony conviction, you now in the state of Minnesota will be eligible to vote as soon as you finish your incarceration. Previously, you couldn't vote until you were done with all parts of a sentence, including parole, probation, supervised release. So that can end up being a lot more time. And so that's voting rights restored for over 55,000 Minnesotans straight away, with major racial equity impacts, as we know, which is remarkable. But that's a bill that was passed, and so we're re-upping some things, and there's a lot of great energy to get things passed, like driver's licenses for all. That there's been advocacy for these things for decades, right? Like advocates are fired up and exhausted, and that's advocacy energy that can then be used in other mission and issue aligned areas. That also means there's a lot happening. It's moving really, really fast. And so I have empathy on a staffing level for what that means for how our government operates, right? So for every idea of a bill that enters the legislative process, this is thousands and thousands every session. There are nonpartisan staffers who write fiscal notes so that legislators can see from the beginning, what would this cost? From what fund? What does that look like, right? There are folks who are working. This is not a process yet, but they're one of the bills that will be introduced at the legislature, if it hasn't already, is about having racial equity impact notes, which I think would be a crucial step in our legislative process, but would do a similar thing, right? So like at the front end, before we decide a policy, we are looking at what the impacts will be to communities of color in our state. And, we just had the first of 3 legislative deadlines last week. And I think staff are just running. And so I'm conscious of people's power, stamina, because we need those people resources to continue to do good work. And also, I think sometimes when things move fast, they can be more inaccessible to the public. And, we're technically the boss, the public. We are the boss. That's a challenge. Opportunities, one, it's like a lot of bills are being passed. It's been a while since we've seen bills signed by the governor this early and at this volume. It also means likely that we'll end the legislative session on time. Maybe not, but I do think that another really important thing to remember, again, if you do that values exercise and one of your values is a democratic process in the way that we have it now, there are other ways to do representative democracy, but in the 2-party system, it's important that there is still a process where there is questioning from whatever party's in the minority, because that has always fluctuated. Folks in the legislature represent many other people who elected them in, and are speaking on their behalf. And so still going through the process, even if it's clear what the votes will show, is important. I think that's what I'll say for now.
Yeah, I think the thing that you said that really just stuck out with me too is something maybe we often don't think about, which is all kind of the man hours and people behind the scenes that aren't the politicians on TV that are actually casting the ballot, that are putting in the work to make the information accessible, to kind of provide expertise, financial notes. I love the idea of having kind of racial equity notes and knowing the impact of that as well. And I'm wondering, kind of my final question to you is, in a world where kind of we are constantly doing things, it seems like, it's kind of a 24/7 news cycle. There's a lot going on. It can be very draining. There's a lot being asked of people across the board, especially people in your kind of position doing public policy work. And I'm just curious, how can people kind of support you in that work or help you or support kind of the things that you're going through, so that we can make sure, you know, people like yourself are not getting burnout or not getting kind of thrown through the grinder without the support that they need to continue to function and add the really necessary contributions that they're bringing to this process.
First, I'm going to take the opportunity, because you said man hours, to say woman hours too, because yesterday was equal pay day. And so women at the legislature are probably getting paid less.
Thank you for that clarification. Very important.
But I think a couple things. I studied abroad in Istanbul, Turkey in college for a month for a leadership seminar. And our leader had us read a piece by Margaret Whitley. I believe that's right. It's a book called Turning Toward One Another, about conversation. And so I think about this when it comes to the 24/7 news cycle. How do we care for ourselves when we are not actually designed to take in the volume of news media that we do, and particularly to your earlier point with this divided rhetoric that we have now? How do we balance that and taking care of ourselves with what we learned from this piece when I was studying abroad, which is like, when I'm not really going to do it justice paraphrasing, but it basically says, when there are terrible things happening in the world and I'm beside myself because there's not really anything that I can do, the very least that I can do is bear witness. And so that's more broadly about like all of us as a populace. I think in terms of public policy and advocacy work, there's a great resource that we use from Deepa Iyer. It's called it's Navigating Our Roles in the Social Change Ecosystem. And there's a new workbook. And so it's a social change ecosystem that she developed with all these different roles. What are the skill sets that I have? What energizes me and what makes sense based on my spheres of influence? And so you can kind of map out, like, what are my roles to do in movement work, in policy work, in being active. And doing that work with other people can help us sort of figure out, okay, like, when can we have a rhythm where there's stepping in, or this we're going to lead, or in coalition work, this we're going to lead. People power often makes a big difference. So having volunteers, having advocates, right? Like, come today on the Hill, we'll all go to meetings together. That also is just energizing. It's energizing to do this work in community. That's one of the really fun parts about being at the Capitol. We're just like, you're always crashing into other people who are doing the work too. But I think that I think those two things. I think like balancing bearing witness, and then thinking about your skill set and your sphere of influence, but also how privilege interplays with that, right? So like, I might do my social change ecosystem map. The goal of that is not that I opt out of stuff that's uncomfy as a white person doing the work, but just that I have more clarity about, like, this is something I'm really good at, and this is something that Chandler's really good at, and this is something that someone else on our team is really good at. And so here's how we're going to fuse that together to be really effective and also to conserve energy.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Luna. This has been really awesome and really helpful, I think, to understand the public policy work that the YWCA does on a more holistic level, because it is, like you said, it's so ingrained with the mission, and racial justice especially plays such an important part of every aspect of that work. So it's really lovely to kind of have you come on and share some of that, and then also talk a little bit more about the kind of current contextual situation that Minnesota is facing, the importance of youth getting involved, the importance of taking care of yourself, and kind of being in community with other people that are working towards the same goal. So thank you so much today for coming and giving us your time. Thank you for the conversation and your questions. I really appreciated them. Yeah, absolutely. And then I wanted to just kind of, for everybody watching the recording, wanted to quickly share a couple updates. For one, we will be not having Coffee and Conversation next month, so we won't be having one in April. We'll be coming back in May, when our girls and youth staff will be speaking a little bit more about some of our programs there, and talking a little bit more about what we've got going on in that space. I also wanted to remind you that in the description for this event on YouTube, especially if you're watching it before March 27th, you can find information on YWCA Day on the Hill or Day at the Capitol, so that you can go and attend and be part of that community and maybe get to know some other people in this space. And that there will also be Luna's contact information on there as well. So you can reach out to her if you have any public policy questions, anything that you'd like to chat with her about. Like she said, she'd love to kind of walk you through any of that stuff. So we'd be happy to help you there. And then the last thing that I want to mention is that upcoming, we also have a great opportunity to get involved with some other things, including our Empower Possible event that's coming up in April, where we'll be kind of celebrating the impact that we've been able to have on the community, but also bringing in members of the community who have done some really incredible stuff this year and celebrating the work that they've done and the difference that they're making, and kind of all coming together to celebrate the progress that we've already accomplished, but also recognize just how much further we have to go. So I just want to thank you again for being here, and thank you for checking out the recording if you're watching this on YouTube. And we will see you later. Have a great day.
Thanks for your support.
Bye.